are listening to Inside Voices on WNHHLP 103.5 FM.
Good morning or good afternoon, wherever people are listening to this Inside Voices episode. I am thrilled to be joined by a woman that I greatly admire and all of the works that she participates in Connecticut as well as throughout the country. I am joined by Jessica Sager of All Our Kin. And again, Jessica, I am worried for this conversation because we are so immersed in this that we may just kind of geek out in our conversation. So I'm hoping that we don't geek out too much here. Welcome, Jessica. How are you?
I am well. I am so happy to be in conversation with you, Georgia. The admiration is very much mutual, and I'm glad to have this time with you.
Yes. So I just want to ground folks. When we just started this conversation, Inside Voices, this podcast radio show, we wanted to ground people first in the history of the work before we start any conversation. And our conversation with folks just kind of evolved to the point that, history is intertwined and, immersed in our conversation. But this is really going to be a conversation about history. And it's going to be the first of many conversations that we're going to have with All Our Kin. And before I get started, Jessica, with you introducing yourself and your agency, I just want to kind of frame for the audience the conversation that we're going to have. And the part of the work that Circle is going to be doing going forward is ensuring that restorative justice is embedded in childcare policies and embedded in the way that we basically rebuild our childcare system going forward, at least in Connecticut, where I'm going to try to do that work along with our Circle team. And I think it's really important to bring you into this conversation, Jessica, because again, from a restorative justice lens, we are looking at the history of childcare and the fact that African Americans, Black women, are the originators, the progenitors of this industry. But the other piece of it that I think not a lot of people know is the evolution of the childcare industry from a family childcare perch, right? And I don't think a lot of people understand that component of the childcare industry. A lot of times people see family childcare business. I think they see all childcare business as babysitting and see us as glorified babysitters. But I think in particular, family childcare providers and family childcare settings really are incredibly misunderstood, even by people within the industry. And you have done so much work just to lift up the voices of those women that are doing this work. And I say women, I can say women, because the majority of this work is being done by women. And especially when we look at family childcare business, a lot of it is by women. And there's a historical context and basis for it. And I know that you share my worry that that history will be lost and those settings will be lost to families. And so that's the basis of the conversation. And when we're talking about restorative justice and policy, just recognizing that there was intention in legislation and policies that got us here, and that we have to be as equally intentional in policies going forward to ensure that we are honoring the places or the place that women, more specifically Black women and family childcare providers have done in building this industry. So that is the framework that we want to start this conversation and continue this conversation from. So Jessica, if you don't mind, just sharing with folks who you are and what All Our Kin is and what it does.
Yeah, thanks so much, Georgia, and thanks for that initial frame. So I am the co-founder and chief executive officer of All Our Kin. I started the organization in New Haven, Connecticut 25 years ago, pretty much the day after I graduated from law school. I actually trained as a lawyer. We can talk about that later. And All Our Kin is really devoted to transforming the way we think about and support and engage with childcare in this country, to actually build a system where children, families, educators can not just get by, but actually thrive, where educators can build wealth and succeed as business owners, where parents can go to work knowing that their children are safe and loved and cared for, and where children can get wonderful, nurturing, high quality early learning experiences. And as you said, we do this by partnering with family childcare educators who are indeed women, and often Black and brown women, who do this work in their homes, creating micro businesses that are an essential source of support for children and families. And I know you know this. I listened to your wonderful conversation with Ms. Norma Stennett, where you really lifted up all the ways in which she is both an educator and a caregiver. That's what we see with family childcare educators in Connecticut and across the country. So we build systems for supporting educators in becoming licensed, in running thriving businesses, in succeeding as teachers and educators with the latest knowledge of child development. And at the same time, we advocate for policies and systems that are really shaped by educator voice and that are responsive to educator and family needs. That model began in New Haven, Connecticut. It spread to different cities across the state and the New York. And now we're really a national organization partnering with organizations in 33 states who are doing pieces of the work that we do. But in our work in Connecticut specifically, it has been really wonderful to work side by side with Circle as we strive to create an equitable system of care.
What I love about the opportunity to do this podcast radio show is to lift up the voices. And you mentioned that you are an attorney by trade. And I'm always blessed to share with folks or have folks share how they entered into this space. So, how does an attorney by trade enter into the world of family childcare advocacy?
Yeah, not on purpose. It was not part of my plan, but it was part of the plan. So here I am. So I came to law school really seeking to be an advocate for children. I have a personal history as the sibling caretaker of a brother with really a constellation of physical, mental, and emotional needs. That journey really drove me to want, as I say, to advocate for children, but I thought that was going to be as a lawyer or a policymaker. And I came to law school, right as welfare reform hit. Now, that is kind of ancient history now, but this was a moment in the late 90s in which the federal government took a really punitive approach to parents who needed cash assistance and forced them to enter the workforce really, really fast. And I became engaged in community-based research, recognizing the incredible lack of childcare support and the really tough choices parents would face. And as I began to talk with folks in the community, I spoke with many incredible family childcare educators, many parents. Collectively, we designed the idea for an organization that, at least here in New Haven, could create options for parents and children. And that's how All Our Kin was born. And once that idea took hold, I couldn't walk away from it. I had to be part of getting it off the ground and making it happen. And I have loved every minute of these 25 years of walking side by side with family childcare educators. And there are many ways in which I use my skills as an attorney to figure out what policies mean and funding streams and argue with bureaucrats. But there are many other ways in which I'm learning from educators all the time. And I really love that balance. And I've learned so much along the way.
So I appreciate you giving that context, and I want you to delve a little bit more deeply into that legislation because you mentioned or you said, oh, it's old news, but for a lot of folks, it's not even new news. And so can you delve a little bit deeper into that and we all know the history, or we think we know the history of welfare reform, but we don't quite know really how it impacted people on the ground. So can you talk a little bit more about how that policy actually impacted how parents were going to experience a new childcare landscape slash working landscape?
Yeah, absolutely. So prior to welfare reform, we had something called Aid to Families with Dependent Children, and it was not a good system for putting out cash assistance into communities, but it was a system. And it was designed really to enable parents, enable moms in particular, to stay home with young children during their formative years. Welfare reform took the approach that every parent should be in the workforce right away, no matter how young their children were, and no matter what childcare options were available to them. And it was based on a lot of stereotyping of parents, to be honest, really ugly stereotyping of parents on cash assistance. It was almost based on the idea that parents don't know what's best for their own children, which is loathsome, right? Like it's a disgusting idea. And parents were saying, what am I supposed to do? How can I go to work when there's no place to find care for my kids? And as an advocate for children, I was horrified that our government would enact legislation that was so cruel for parents, so cruel for families, and so thoughtless
Well,
about children's needs.
well, and as you're talking, and not to interrupt you, but there
Go
was
for
a
it.
context for how they did this, because the Aid to Dependent Children, when it initially came into being, was designed for white women specifically to
Right.
stay home with their children because they felt that was the best context for white children. So Black mothers and Black and brown women have always been in the workforce and have always been working. So I want us to really understand that when this policy was initially implemented, this legislation was initially implemented, it was designed specifically because legislators who were basically seeing their wives and mothers caring for children understood what was needed. And when the face of who was at home with children changed, and it didn't necessarily change statistically, it's just changed in the framing when the welfare queen became cast as a Black woman. And so, pick up the story from that context.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's a stereotype that I almost didn't want to name because I don't want to give it power, but that is
But we
exactly the stereotype that we're talking about, the
have to
stereotype of the welfare queen, right?
You have to
This,
give it power,
this,
Jessica, because
yeah,
isn't that how we continue to craft policies that are really hurting people, because we as the good people don't want to name what the bad people, the strategy that they're using. And it still exists today.
yeah, it does. And you know what's really interesting is that that same stereotype that is applied to Black and brown women as parents is often the same stereotype that we see applied to family childcare educators, right? These are business people. They're running thriving businesses that are driving the economy, that are sources of support for families in their neighborhoods. They are teachers, they are educators, and yet this welfare queen stereotype is mapped onto the work that they are doing. And in our earliest years, Georgia, I cannot tell you how often we, and by we, I mean myself, but I also mean the family childcare educators with whom I was walking into these rooms, we were literally laughed out of these rooms, like laughed at. The idea that this work could be taken seriously, that family childcare could be education, that it could be business. I mean, the first 10 years of All Our Kin was like 10 years of making that case, of showing up at meetings, of assembling the data to show the economic impact and the educational impact and the impact on parents, and telling that story again and again. Because when people have a stereotype in their minds, it takes a lot to undo that stereotype. And we've come a long way, but Georgia, as you know, we are not there yet. That work continues.
I think about the juxtaposition of women, and more specifically women of color, but this is a women-driven industry, so let's just name that. I think of the juxtaposition of women building a thriving business from their homes, from their living room, and a tech bro building a tech business out of his garage, and how those mythologies are just received differently in in society, right? Because it's the same thing. We venerate men who, with some like strings and some cans build a whole tech industry, but while denigrating the ingenuity of women in doing this work, more specifically because we're women and because we're women of color. But the pandemic kind of laid bare the fact that, you know what, this is an industry that is critical infrastructure. So, did you have that experience? I mean, you talked about that 10 years of doing this work. Did you see a pivot and a shift? Because the pandemic definitely shifted a lot of
Yeah.
things, and we could see that. But when in that between that in that 20 years of working and that 10 years that you talked about, when did you see the shift, and what was the catalyst for that shift?
Yeah, so we began to see a shift in the conversation in the period just prior to the pandemic, right? So by 2015, we had so much data showing the economic impact of family childcare businesses. We had so many parents saying, we choose family childcare because this is a setting we want for our children, as in your conversation with Ms. Norma, right? This is the place where I want my infant or toddler to be. This is the place that creates a safe place for my child that meets the needs of my particular job and my working hours. This is a setting I choose. And we began to see family childcare showing up differently in legislation, being talked about differently, being included in funding in ways it had not before. But what we still didn't see was funding for the childcare system overall. So we've made strides in including family childcare in that system, and still we see that there is not enough money in the system. So the pandemic hit and childcare became really visible. It became visible to upper middle class white people because it was like right there on their Zoom screens. And suddenly we were having a national conversation about childcare where we were saying, it's such an important driver to the economy. It's so important for parents to succeed in the workforce, especially moms. We started to talk about how women lose so much in earnings over their lifetimes, up to $600,000 because they can't find childcare. We started to talk about all these things. And yet, Georgia, here's the irony. I made a speech in 2022 where I said, okay, the pandemic has happened and we're all talking about childcare and everything is going to change now. And it didn't. It didn't. We almost put through the federal Build Back Better Act $400 billion into childcare. And we didn't. And I still get choked up thinking about it.
Why do you think that was?
It's really interesting. It comes down to politics. It comes down to who's in the room. And there were just a couple of key senators who did not want the bill to pass because they did not believe in government spending, because they did not value or prioritize the well-being of families and educators. And those few voices were enough to shut it down. Just a couple of people. Like, we were so close. And I think about this a lot because I think what we need, Georgia, is a childcare movement. And this is part of why we're working in so many states now where no senator can ignore the fact that families need childcare to thrive. That being callous actually carries a political price, because the senators who shut the legislation down, they did not pay a price for that. They just demonstrated their power and their control by stopping this legislation. And it was purely a political act.
It is a political act, but it's rooted in a particular belief, right?
Oh, yeah.
So, I have my notions about what that belief is, but that's also is framed by, the skin that I live in and the gender that I live in, right? So from your perspective, what were some of the conversations that you were hearing? Because I remember when I had the privilege to testify before Congress to get $50 billion into the childcare system. I was privy to some of the conversations behind the scenes with those same legislators, those same federal legislators. And some of it was, oh, we can't afford to do this, but it was also rooted in this sort of like this traditional archaic view of how women are functioning in their homes or how households are functioning. It's just like, once again, women should be at home caring for the children, or grandma should be supporting caring for the children. And then they made a political decision based on that. So, can you talk to me about what you've heard in your 20 years of work around this concept and this notion that we're still living in the, little house on the prairie type economy where women
Yeah.
can just be at home and or grandmas are at home, knitting and taking care of the children. Meanwhile, grandmas are also in the workforce. So have you heard some of those conversations? Because that was certainly some of the conversation that I heard from those legislators.
Absolutely. And we're hearing those conversations now, right? We hear those conversations all the time at the present moment. So there's what people say, and then there's why they say it. So let me unpack both those things.
Mhm.
So first, you're very right. There are, for many people, there's this fixed idea that women, and really we're talking about white women, let's be honest, right? Like white women should be home in the kitchen caring for children. And that is the best and highest use of their time and the best way to preserve family values. So there's that like baseline assumption women should be home, whether that has anything to do with women's preferences, with women's skills, with where children actually thrive, with like just the reality of today doesn't matter. There's like this fixed ideal of the mom in the kitchen
Mhm.
that people have a hard time letting go of. And that's really rooted in gender stereotypes, right? And ideas of like a perfect nuclear family. But then you take it further and you really do get into issues of systemic racism and xenophobia,
Mhm.
starting with racism. So, this belief that legislators have such a hard time letting go of that childcare is not valuable work, that
Mhm.
it's babysitting, that it's a second best, that it shouldn't be highly compensated. As you've said, that is really rooted in the fact that our childcare system is built on a history of enslaving Black women and stealing their labor, right? Like that's how we built our childcare system. And those assumptions go into every decision that we make about how childcare should be paid for and what the quality of that care looks like and what it means to be a childcare educator. And then you layer onto that a history of exploiting and underpaying brown women, especially immigrants. You think about the xenophobia that goes along with that.
Mhm.
You layer that in, and you have a system that's all built around devaluing the labor of care. I mean, you know this. Childcare educators are paid less than dog walkers because we think the work of walking dogs is more valuable than the work of caring for children. And that has to do with really this history of exploiting labor. And by exploiting it, we devalue it. And it becomes this vicious circle where we underpay the people who are doing probably the most important work in the world. That is building the brains, building the well-being of our next generation of humans. So we've seen that for 25 years. And while the way it looks has shifted, and we do see the system shifting, we continue to see those preconceptions. And until we really unpack and change the frame that we use around childcare, it's going to be really hard to move public will around it. And you have done a particularly good job, I think, of lifting that up and elevating that in conversation.
Well, I hope so. Again, as you said, I was not as optimistic as you, Jessica, to make that things were going.
Right.
Because in my personal life, I hear how the view of early care educators are still viewed. I had a conversation with a close friend, and he was sharing that, he was sharing that his daughter, was commenting on the fact that I forget which, that teachers weren't being paid
Mm.
like, well in Puerto Rico, and that, she was, incredulous at how low teachers were being paid. And then I mentioned I was agreeing, and he was like, pushing back against that notion and that idea. And I mentioned that, early care educators were being paid less than dog walkers. And his comment was, well, I'm talking about teachers,
Right. Yes, yes,
right?
yes.
And
Yeah.
so again, whenever I have certain conversations with people in my circle, in my sphere, there is still that idea that there are teachers and there are daycare workers, right? And that the vision of the work that we do are not seen in the same way. So to the extent that I have to accept that, yeah, there, I absolutely know there's xenophobia and racism and sexism that's built into the legislative policies. We've documented that. But we were having a conversation in a last show with Bill Okusa from Good Child, in Milford, and we were talking about the fact that the pushback that he gets as a male in this space,
Huh.
definitely from parents, and from the very people that are in this industry advocating for a different way of operating in terms of who delivers care and how care is compensated. So what can we say about, because again, there is that social context, but there's also a cultural context as well. And I want to delve a little bit more into the cultural context, because in my country, I'm from Jamaica, we don't necessarily see childcare as the preferred venue for caregiving. We usually see a family member coming in and caring for our children. And I'm sure in different cultures that shows up as well. But beyond the cultural context, there is also this social context that people see this work as just nurturing and caregiving and don't see, the education and the brain building and the mental health component of this work as even integral into the things that we do today on a day-to-day basis. So can you speak to that social context?
Yeah, and I really love how you broke that down, and I want to speak to each piece of what you talked about. So, first, the role of care, the importance and the value of care, and the shared responsibility for care is something that I think we really have to grapple with as a society. And there's a much broader movement happening specifically around care and collective responsibility, that it should be shared by women and men, that it should be shared by us collectively as a nation, that we all deserve care and we all deserve a role in providing care.
Mhm.
That care is a blessing and it's also really hard work. And we want to create a society where care is valued and where those who need care have access to it and those who provide care are honored for it. So rewriting that story of care and the value of care, that's number one. Number two is the brain building piece. You have to hold both. It's early care and education, and both of those things matter. The fact that your friend would say, well, there are teachers, that doesn't surprise me, right? But it's so ironic because In fact, we know that children's brains are literally built during the earliest years, that there is no more critical phase of brain development than the period 0 to 3. And so the folks who are interacting with children during that time are playing an incredibly important role in their development and their learning. And I want to be really clear, that can be a parent, that can be a grandmother, that can be a kin member, that can be a neighbor, that can be a professional who cares for generations of children, whether that's in a family childcare or in a childcare program. But we line the way up, we value these, and you're right, there's teachers, there's childcare workers, and then there's family childcare educators, not recognizing that, in fact, the role of all these folks is to educate. And also, by the way, that the role of parents is also to educate, and we should honor and support that too. That requires us thinking really differently as a nation and holding care and education foremost in our minds.
Do you think and when I say we, folks in the profession, do we have a responsibility and a duty? Because again, I can see ways that we kind of uphold those gender norms, right? Because again, when we think about this work and we think about propelling ourselves out of poverty, the first thing, as a matter of fact, many family childcare providers and many childcare businesses started with a woman saying, you know what, this is going to be my best path forward in terms of maintaining myself before I go back into the workforce, right? And so a lot of those are the foundation. A lot of that thinking by us is really the foundation of this work. And I have to challenge us because, I have to challenge all parts of the system. In some ways, I see how we perpetuate that in our conversation a lot around care. And it's important because primarily parents are choosing us for care. But sometimes I think we kind of, emphasize the care aspect in our work as a way to sort of like bring people in. And then we don't necessarily, as educators, do the work that we need to do as our part of our professional journey to kind of build the credential that's needed to do this work well. And I'm trying to say this without, saying that there's more that we need to do and there's ways that we kind of hold the system without not recognizing the challenges in doing this really well when there's no resources. So can you talk about our responsibility, just even to us in this industry, to kind of change the way that we even approach this work?
Yeah, so, this aligns so well with the way that we at All Our Kin think about our work with educators. So the first is on the business side. So I just want to stay there for a minute. The idea that family childcare programs should be sustainable businesses that enable childcare providers to actually build wealth and own their homes and have a path towards long-term sustainability and retirement. We need to fight for that. We need to name the fact that a lot of our childcare system is paid for by people not getting paid, right, for the work that they're doing.
So is that genuinely though how this work is viewed by us? And I just want to be reflective and speak truth to power of this, because again, I've heard so many women that remain in the industry that, well, it was something to do, so to kind of maintain myself until I can get back into the work. And so there is a group still within us that kind of see this as, well, this is something to do while I get to the real thing that I wanted to do.
Yeah. For some folks, maybe that's okay. I will tell you that at All Our Kin, we have so many educators who have cared for generations of children, who maybe start thinking they'll do this for one group of kids and then realize that they are passionate about it, that they are really skilled at it, and that this is their life's work. And those folks are building businesses. And in my experience, like if they have an opportunity, they are eager to tell that story about how and why it is their life's work and how and why it's a business. And for too long, our narrative has been, okay, great. You are doing this work that is rooted in love, and love is better than money. And you know what? You need love and you need money, right? You need both.
I think it's so interesting because we're the only one that accepts that. Men would never, ever be like, oh, and I shouldn't say that. There are lots of men that make decisions about their profession because of the love that they have for it, and they would forego money. But as a general, I hear this so many times, Jessica. It's just like I hear women sacrificing their family economic stability because they're just like, oh, I just love this parent, I love this child, I love this work, and I want to do this. And it's just like, again, going back to, are we upholding some of the systemic, institutions that are preventing us from moving this industry forward?
Yeah, and I think that gets back to how you began this question, which is talking about like, is this education? Are we doing enough to show that what we are doing is education? And at All Our Kin, one of the things we work really hard to do is bring educators the very latest knowledge of child development, the very latest brain science. Our educators are so skilled, so knowledgeable. What they deliver is so high quality. And I think we can work harder to tell that story. And I think we need to work harder to tell that story. And it's funny because I've been thinking about this a lot. During COVID, we talked so much about parents getting back to work that we kind of stopped talking about children, and the impact of early childhood education on the children themselves is something that I think we need to bring back into the conversation, both because it's like super important, right? Like it literally is the next generation, and because it's why the work is so valuable. Yes, the work is valuable because parents can go to work, and it's valuable because it's teaching, because it's education, because it is education at a level that I would challenge most college professors to engage in, and yet we don't think of it that way. So yes, getting back to telling the story of how this work is education as well as care, I think is something that we need to do collectively as a profession.
I'm so glad you brought up our reframing during the pandemic because, again, going back to, we kind of have to own some of the stuff, but I want to still give us grace to the fact that we're just trying to get eyes on this and to shift a generation of thinking from, and we're not even just talking about just from the welfare reform, but just from Social Securities Act, from post slavery, so it's like all these things that we have to shift, and we're trying to pitch ourselves to so many different constituents to get them to pull them in and to get them to buy in. And there was a shift around the conversation, during the pandemic about the fact that, well, childcare is critical because we need to get people back to work. And, women have lost like 20 years of progress in the workforce when, they were, removed and could not come back in because of the loss of the childcare sector, right? And we see that connection always in legislation. Whenever there's movement in legislation, it's always tied to what the broader industries need and basically what men need, right? And so again, during World War II, when we had the first and only time when we had universal childcare in America was because we needed women to help with the war effort, right? And then that went to the wayside after that. And, more specifically during the Social Security Act, the New Deal, Black women, because they were still the face of childcare, they were excluded from those labor protections. And then during the pandemic again, that shift occurred again. And we kind of, and I'm guilty, I will say it, you know, traffic in that conversation. And then it became more about childcare being a workforce and an emergency infrastructure rather than going back to the care and the education. So, I'm going to give you, a few minutes to just kind of respond to that. It's a lot. And we're going to have this continued conversation because it's so much to unpack, but a lot to, but just respond to that briefly.
Yeah. So, in 25 years, I have seen the conversation change and change and change. And I think the balance as an advocate, and every educator I know is an advocate, is between like seizing that moment, right? What do people care about right now? Is it the economy? Is it children's brain development, which it was for like 3 years, right? What is it we can use to make people pay attention, to make people see us and see our work in a different way, right? So how do you seize that moment for maximum investment in the profession overall, with the tension of how do we get people to see the whole of what childcare educators do? How do we reframe and step back and change the conversation and make it bigger? And that's a lot of what we have tried to do at All Our Kin, with educator stories, with educator testimony, with data about the quality of educators' work and the economic impact and power of family childcare. We've shown that every dollar invested in family childcare has a return of $15 to the economy, right? That's exciting. And you never want someone to be just a return on investment. How do we talk about the whole of the educator and what educators deserve and what children deserve and what families deserve? So there's the big frame, and then there's like the short term, what can you move as an advocate? And that back and forth, that tension, I think part of what you and I strive to do is to live that balance and that tension. I don't have a perfect answer for it, but I think that's what we try to do. I also wanted to say a word, which is that educators should not be solely responsible for this advocacy. Family childcare educators, in my experience, work 14 hours a day, maybe 16 hours a day, and then come out to advocate. What about parents? What about business people? What about our political leaders, right? We cannot ask educators to take this on as yet more unpaid labor. We need more folks standing up for childcare, standing up for children and families, and standing up for educators. Because again, it's unpaid labor, this work of advocacy in many cases, and it's work that we need to recognize, and it's work that we need to support and engage in collectively.
So with that, Jessica, I'm going to say that is an amazing framing, because if I think about All Our Kin, and All Our Kin is really doing that macro framing, and a part of Circle is to plug into that macro framing, but really speaks very specifically about how women and children of color are impacted by this work. So I so appreciate you giving name that we have to do both and you guys are doing some really exciting thing at All Our Kin. So could you take the next couple of minutes to talk about the work that you are getting ready to do with family childcare providers?
Yeah. No, please go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Yeah. So first, let me talk a little bit about our work in Connecticut. It's wonderful to get to partner with you at Circle as we really advocate for a different kind of childcare system. You know that we've had some recent legislative wins that are really promising towards funding the childcare system. you also know that there is more that needs to happen in our state. So we're very much engaged in the work of advocacy. And at the same time, we work directly, as you do, with family childcare educators. So we're providing licensing support, we're providing business training, we're providing educational coaching and professional learning. And that work is expanding now to more and more parts of the state. We are able now to partner with family childcare networks all over Connecticut to make some of these offerings available. And that's in response to educators saying to us, we want all our kin to be across the state. So we're beginning to be able to do that, which is really exciting. So we have some great opportunities both in advocacy and in educator partnership and training, and in particular, educator accreditation through the National Association of Family Childcare, which I think is really important because it is that mark of professionalism that we were speaking about, Georgia, and getting folks to honor and recognize the work of family childcare. And along with that, I'll just put in a really quick plug, which is we're actually having a screening of a documentary called Make a Circle, which is about the early education workforce this Thursday night at 7. Folks can learn about that on our website. And we're going to have a talkback panel with family childcare educators where you can hear directly from them about their work. So that's some of what we're doing in Connecticut. We're doing that work directly on the ground in New York City as well. So that means we're reaching educators across New York. And we're also, as I mentioned, partnering all across the country with agencies who are looking at what has been achieved in Connecticut and saying, how do we do this? How do we bring in part of what all our kin and their partners have succeeded in doing? And we've been teaching them how to lead our trainings and our workshops. But honestly, Georgia, more importantly, we've been teaching them how to engage in partnership with educators in a respectful way where educators are leading and shaping the work and are integral to shaping the policy systems all across the country. So that's a lot, and it's a lot right now when there's a lot pushing back against us. But it feels good to feel that we have, now a mighty community of family childcare educators in Connecticut and beyond. And with partners like you and Circle, we've created a voice that really will not and cannot be silenced.
So, and as a part of our final wrap up, and again, it's not final for us in this episode, but it's not a final conversation. How do we ensure that that restorative justice lens is embedded in policies to make sure that family childcare providers are occupying the space that not only history demands for them to occupy, but families demand for them to occupy? What work has to be done to ensure that that happens in Connecticut and across the country?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And I've been thinking about it so much recently because our legislators are not going to bring that frame. And so that requires us to internalize that frame and make sure that what we are demanding is big enough to incorporate that restorative justice. And I think that has to do with wealth building. It has to do with pay equity. It has to do with respect. It has to do with a completely different culture in which we honor not only the education and care that children are receiving now, but, a legacy of hundreds of years of that work going unpaid. What's the ask then? How do we have that big ask in our minds? And maybe we can't put it on the table right now because we don't want to scare people, but we know in our minds what that looks like, and that we hold that North Star and that vision, even in tough times, even in a changing federal climate, as what we are moving towards. And that's what we're fighting for. And we know that on the other side, maybe is some of this federal stuff that's happening, that's what we're going to get to. But we have to hold that vision clear, and we have to name it. We have to honor and value the work explicitly of Black and Brown educators, of generations of women who did this work without recompense, often against their will. We have to honor the devaluing of children and families and what it is that children and families deserve from us today. And we have to hold that big North Star in our minds, a truly equitable society. And if you were to ask me, Georgia, I would say educators should be like at the top of our highest paid professions. That's what it would really look like, right? We would value this work above almost all other work. We would say, this is the most important job that is. And we would bring the honor and the respect and money that accrues to the value of the work. That's what it would take for restorative justice really to begin.
My hope is that we don't get to that point before we get to the point of honoring the work that women have to do as mothers, and
Yeah.
very difficult work. And I know we kind of, people kind of say sometimes in a pejorative that, oh, this is the hardest work, but I can tell you it is hard work. We are raising human beings, and I do want to honor the men who are standing side by side in doing this work, and they don't get enough credit for coming into this space and breaking down those barriers for other men. But definitely, and Jessica, I'm going to push back a bit because I want to name what it's going to cost.
Do you have a number?
I think it's a flaw of our gender in that we oftentimes don't want to scare people by saying really what is it that it's going to take to properly restore in this industry what has been lost, robbed, diminished, devalued over all of those hundreds of years of doing this. And I think it's important for us to name it. I remember when we said to the legislators, it's going to be 700, it's going to require a $700 million investment in childcare. People gasp. Right? But we're now at a place where we have an endowment where, we're envisioning $1 billion of investments in this industry. So I think it's critical and important for us to name this, right? Any final words that you want to say before we pause this conversation?
Yeah, I want to thank you for lifting up the need to name a number. Build Back Better was $400 billion federally, and that wasn't enough. But Georgia, that is a good start. I would take that 400 billion. I'll put that number on the table gladly. And I want to join you in honoring the work of parents. I'm a parent myself. As you know, my daughter just began college. I know what this journey means. I know what it takes for a parent to entrust their child to an educator. And I want to thank all the parents out there for the incredibly important work that they do, and express my hope that we can build a childcare system that truly meets your needs as parents and brings you joy.
Well, you guys are a formidable force in this work. I would not want to be in front of you, Jessica. You're a tiny woman, Jessica, but you have such a force behind you that I certainly would not want to be in front of you as we're moving towards this. All Our Kin is just an amazing organization, and I so appreciate all of the work that you guys do. And I will just share that Circle, you were the first person outside of the Circle team that knew about the vision and the idea of Circle. And you were so gracious to sit with us when we started this journey to say, to give us encouragement and to share to hear our vision and to give us some pointers. So I just want to lift that up as well to folks.
I'm honored to have been part of it. What you do is amazing. And I'm so glad I was here with you today.
Yeah. So again, thrilled to have with us Jessica Sager from All Our Kin. And Jessica, again, we are going to continue this conversation with All Our Kin with some of your other folks about how do we embed restorative justice in this work, in policies, in legislation, because again, we did not get here by chance or happenstance. We got here intentionally by purpose. And I think we have to have a purpose-driven lens as we move our way forward. Okay. So look forward to working with you and all our kin in that journey. Thank you all. Thank you, Jessica, for being here.
Thank you.
You are listening to Inside Voices on WNH.